All right, good evening, everyone. It is September 25th, 2024, and this is a public meeting of the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, Community Engagement Subcommittee. Great to see everybody. I'm going to pass it over to our co-chair, Tia, to get us started.
Great. Thank you. Let's go ahead and start with introductions, and I will start. My name is Tia Palafox, and I'm the co-chair of the PCCEP Community Engagement Subcommittee. Thank you all for coming, and let's start with PCCEP members. Who else here tonight from PCCEP?
Hi, my name is Carrie Driver. I'm a PCCEP member and a member of the Community Engagement Subcommittee.
Thank you. Let me look through here.
Hi, this is Kip. I was trying to find my unmute button. Kip Silverman, PCCEP member, he, him pronouns. Also co-chair of the Settlement and Policies Subcommittee.
Great, thank you both for coming. Is that all we have for PCCEP members tonight?
I see Devonte's here as well.
Oh, great. Devonte.
Hello, everyone. My name is Devonte Manyweather, PCCEP member or PCCEP. Sorry for not being on camera. I am in transit. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.
Great. Thank you. And then if the city folks can introduce themselves and anyone that's working with the city and mayor's office and PPB. Thank you.
Thanks, Tia. Hi, everybody. Stephanie Howard from the mayor's office.
Good evening, folks. Mary Claire Buckley from the Portland Police Bureau.
Thanks for coming. Great.
You bet.
Hi, my name is Nick McDonald. I'm a policy analyst with Public Safety Bureau.
Thank you. And if all the committee members, thank you for coming tonight, and please introduce yourselves in the chat so we know that you're here tonight and can keep that on record.
And I'll keep it going. I'm Dory
Okay.
Verbinski, PCCEP project manager. I see a few more folks here.
Thank you.
I'm Sarah Ames, she, her pronouns, Deputy City Attorney.
All right. I think that's everyone for now. Shall we move on?
Sure, thank you. Each week we start with our community agreements, and the agreements for PCCEP is listen actively and respectfully, share airtime, be present and open to new information and perspectives, assume positive intent, respect each other, respect the group, speak your own truth, communicate directly, honestly, and respectfully, ask questions to clarify, call out bias, and be okay with ambiguity. Tonight's overview of today's meeting is we'll be going over the 2023 last year's Portland Police Bureau stops report and looking at the history and initial review of that. Then we'll be having a discussion with FitCog, the Focus Intervention Team Community Oversight Group, I think, about the stops data. And then we'll open it up for public comment and be able to have an open discussion about stops data tonight. Thank you all for coming. And now for the agenda, let's go ahead and start with the data history. And is Nick taking that on?
Yeah, so for this piece, actually invited Pastor Wisner to speak a little bit about some of the origins of the Stops Data report.
Oh, okay.
And I
great.
think he might have spoken to a few other folks as well who know a lot about this. I did include a slide, if we could go to that, just so folks can see that. There's a lot of text here. But it does have kind of an interesting history. So I'll pass it over to Pastor Wisner now. I'm really grateful he could join tonight. And Pastor Wisner, yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you.
You, Dory, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
I'm sorry, I was on mute there. But what I was saying is,
Oh, I think you muted again. We heard you.
that's it.
Okay, there you go. Yeah.
And then I was saying I was in the spot, so I might fade out here or there, but let me know if you can't hear me.
Will do.
I did a little write-up so I kind of remember my points here. So it might be great that I did. But basically again,
Oh, we
Kruger.
lost you again.
There
you are. Yeah.
Can you get me now?
Yeah.
So again, history says that Chief Kroger actually at that time created a blue ribbon panel to be able to look at some of the serious issues that was implementing the Black community as far as police stops. And in that, it was definitely recommended that there was enough data to be able to be created. And in that data that was going to be shared, I think it was one of his goals out of what he had wrote up for what they call the partnership, police partnership, improving with the community itself. The report did have a blue ribbon panel that consisted of what he wanted to have as far as community involvement. I believe leaders, Bureau of Emergency at that time, business leaders all convened. I must say that one of the proudest moments I got to hear about was when Bishop Wells spoke about how clear that the report in itself was help us to define what we call this how to be stopped and when to be stopped from the African American Advisory Council that worked with the Bureau that was distributed to our community on those type of stops. As we know historically, most of the traffic stops that actually occurred being again primarily focusing out.
You cut out again.
Than it was with whites or other groups during their interaction. As everyone probably already know, again, is that the data even currently, and I'm hopeful that I did hear that the FIT and Dr. Gina Rowland, who has a great report that I've listened to through the FIT, has a tremendous amount of discussion on this here tonight. Did I hit that pretty good for you, Dory?
Yes, that was great. And I think if anyone has questions for Pastor Wisner, feel free to raise your hand. But I think just providing that background of where it all comes from and why this data started being collected to begin with, I think is really important to frame PCCEP's work and why PCCEP looks at it.
If you can hear me, one of the things that, again, from some of the bad part of this, I believe even Senator Gordley at that one time was part of the ribbon that there was a move into the areas of what they created, which was a first Human Rights Commission group, which I was on that advisory board that was supposed to continue with Lisa. She was of the Latino Network, and her name is slipping me right now, who chaired that and did a tremendous job of doing that work. But again, it's very important to realize, even from what I'm seeing in this current report, a lot of questions still arises. And I'm glad that PCCEP and this group is taking a very deep dive into it. I don't want it to be considered what I've heard somewhere along the line saying that the data is kind of hard to analyze to get on what type of stops here or what type of stops there. It's a report card. And the report card is showing that it's actually not working. So anything from there, from what I understand, as much as I do, and that's very little, is that it shows not to give an excuse to why, but more so how are we improving it and moving toward that. And that's what I think this discussion is strong for in the community right now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Any questions for Pastor Wisner before we move on?
What? Oh,
Oh, go ahead, Tia.
what was the year that it began or started popping up?
I believe it was, I can't remember the exact year Kroger was chief, but I believe it was in 98, 99, 2000 maybe.
Wow. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, right around there. I think we have 2000 on the slide, so the work probably started around then.
And the first group was, again, those in the community. There's a lot of reports from inside our African American news groups who covered a lot of that first group and talked with some of those leaders. I couldn't get in touch with Senator Gordley to ask her to speak tonight, or others, Dr. Haynes. But I think, again, this is a very important topic.
Very good. All right. Thank you so much, Pastor Wisner. If there aren't any other questions, I think we can move on to our next part. Does that sound good to you?
Sounds good.
Alrighty.
Okay. Moving on to the Portland Police Bureau's annual stops report with a presentation by Nick McDonald, the performance analyst with the City of Portland. Thank you so much for being here, and you can take it away.
Hey,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, my role, I'm a performance analyst with the public safety area. My day job is to help senior leadership make evidence-based policy decisions and to try to drive the quality of policy that we make by applying analysis and data. So my role here today is to help you folks with any questions you might have about how to interpret what is, a little bit of a dense technical report at times. So I thought maybe I'd just go over a couple of things that that are sort of my observations, and then maybe we can just have a discussion about what's on folks' minds. Feel free, if you want to stop me, to ask questions about any of this. I'm happy to chat about it. If I miss something in the chat, maybe you can, Dory, maybe you can jump in. So the purpose of this data collection, it stems from a time where there was a lot of concern about over-policing, particularly of Black and brown communities. And this stems, my understanding, from a desire to understand the ways in which our traffic stops might have systematic bias on a number of aspects. So either racial or by sex or by mental health status. So we have, just looking at the page 4 here, the things that are called out here, we have a 26% increase over the previous year in the number of stops. And the first time that we've seen the number of stops increase in 5 years. The major reason for that is the reinstatement of the traffic division. The vast majority of our stops are carried out by the traffic division, and they are primarily about traffic violations, mainly moving violations. So these are officers who are patrolling, looking for dangerous driving or expired tags or whatever it is, stopping people for that. And these have gone up largely because we devote more officers to doing that. We can get into benchmarking. Maybe we'll get into benchmarking right now, actually. So the idea of benchmarking is we make these 17,000 stops every year, and we record the officer's impression of the race and a few other statistics about people. And we might compare that to the racial disposition of the city of Portland, and we might say, well, are we stopping certain groups of people more than you would expect based on their proportion of the population? So you might say, well, we stop white people, 61% of our stops are of white people, and white people make up 66% of the population of Portland. So we're stopping white people maybe 5% less than you would expect. Now, the problem with that as a benchmark is that we're not stopping people randomly. The traffic division tends to focus on areas with the highest traffic incidence rates. The non-traffic divisions tend to patrol in areas with higher crime rates. So you might say, well, actually what we want to do is reflect that police spend more of their time in areas with higher crime, and those areas tend to be poorer. They tend to have a higher concentration of Black and brown people. And so you would naturally expect that we might stop Black and brown people more than we would stop white people, simply because police are going to spend more of their time patrolling areas with higher crime. There are all kinds of issues with this as a benchmark too, principally because people on the road is not necessarily reflected in the makeup of the demographics of the city. People drive at different rates, they take public transit at different rates, people come into the city from out of town. So the benchmark that PPB has recommended is the injury collision benchmarks. So one of the nice things about this benchmark is it takes the demographics of people who are injured in traffic collisions in the geographic area where the stop takes place. So if you take a particular part of the city, you then say, because the police are required to be called anytime there's a traffic injury with a traffic collision with an injury, we have pretty good data on the racial breakout of people and the relative frequency in any given area of traffic collisions, injury collisions. And that's a pretty good breakout of A, people who are on the road, and B, people who are engaged in driving, which is more likely to cause a collision, which causes an injury, and also more likely to cause them to be pulled over by a police officer. So the argument for this benchmark is you want to compare for any particular piece of geography, how are we doing in terms of the breakout of the demographics of the people we stop for our police stops versus the rate at which that demographic is involved in traffic collisions which cause injuries. Does that make sense? Does anyone do you want to give a thumbs up or down on whether that makes sense as a concept, or why we're benchmarking against that?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and my name is Odelia. Sorry I'm late. I'm the co-chair of this subcommittee. I think like a lot of these processes are super confusing and unclear, and that we hear justification and like I can see the reason sometimes behind that, but as people who aren't data specialists, it's hard, I think, to see like what's missing or what's wrong with things like this and tools like this that are used. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit in relation to the benchmark, because I know last year I had some trouble with it and didn't understand it, and I felt like it was being misused to justify racial disparities instead of to like do something else, if that makes sense. If you could speak to that a little bit, that would be awesome.
So I'm worried I might be about to disappoint you, because I am not able to answer the question for you of whether there are racial disparities in
right. Yeah.
That's a judgment that you have to make. What I can help you do is maybe interpret the data, talk about methodology. If there are specific questions you have about why you came away thinking last year that this was being used to justify things, I can help maybe throw some light on that from a methodological perspective. Spoiler alert, I don't have a definitive decision for you about whether well, I have some. So do you have a specific question about last year you want to get into, or?
I feel like so Kip made a kind of point to Odelia's question in the chat, and then Liz, could you pull up the slide with PCEP's questions? Because I feel like this is what you're getting at, Odelia, kind of what you spoke to. I think it's a good question for Nick. Yeah, this first question here is sort of, so how should PCEP think about like these methodologies and the disparities that do show up in the context of,
Right.
The committee can understand there are these larger things at play as well, but how is the Bureau making efforts to sort of isolate like their practices in that context, I think is one of the questions that's emerged.
Yeah, Pastor Wiseman, do you want to chime in on this?
I was following your question of how to approach the answer for you. So I'll come behind that question. But yes, I'll come behind that question.
Okay. Pierre or Kip?
Yeah. I heard you say when you were speaking that the higher crime rates are patrolled more. And then at the same time, right after that, I saw Kip's message about high collision areas. Is a crime area similar to a collision area?
No, they're not the same. So we have.
I know they're not the same.
No, so no. There are two main issues we're dealing with here. There's the traffic department, which make up the vast majority of our stops. And then there are the non-traffic stops, which the biggest is the FIT team. So people are pulled over by the police for these kind of things for two reasons. Either an officer shows a traffic violation and they pull them over primarily for that traffic violation, or, and we'll get into this a little more with the FIT team, they pull them over for a traffic violation, but that's not the primary reason why they get pulled over. And that's sometimes called a pretext stop.
Okay, thank you.
So maybe I can ask my question from data and from your perspective of the data that is actually being analyzed. Because again, it gets into the weeds of whether that the reasoning of the stop is assimilated to the amount of areas patrolled and the type of patrolling area that the police do and different communities, as well as traffic in itself. With it, what it does along in order is just simply following the ordinance of driving on the road, stop signs, whatever. Yeah. But in the area, my question is, from your analyzing this data with the disproportion of African Americans being stopped, that would appear to be, and that's the question, a little higher, regardless of how the roads of the amount of African Americans in the state or in the city is definitely being showing a report that they are being stopped with the type of information that is being showed. Is that a fair question to ask the analyst?
So you're saying that we're stopping African Americans and Black people at a higher rate than you would expect by their population in the city?
Correct.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So if you look at the basic stops data, you see that we stop African Americans make up about 6% of the city, and we stop them at a higher rate than that. Benchmarking is the idea that is the wrong method to use, right? Because when you look at the rate at which African Americans are involved with collision injuries, you find that is higher than you would expect from the general population. So African Americans make up 6% of the population. They make up 17% of the injury collision statistics. And when you use that as the benchmark, the rate at which each group is involved in injury collisions, that disparity in stops disappears from traffic. So let's just talk about traffic stops. So what you would say, what the police bureau I think would say here is that, well, our traffic officers are patrolling in areas with highest risk of dangerous traffic conditions, and African Americans are involved at an elevated rate in injury traffic collisions. And so you would expect us to be stopping African Americans at about the rate at which they're involved in traffic injury collisions.
Correct.
And so that I think the Police Bureau would say that that is the correct benchmark to use, not the baseline of how many African Americans, what the percentage of African Americans living in the city is. Does that make sense?
That does, and very much so, yes.
Kip, are you still on this same train of thought with sort of the, like kind of what you put in the chat and Odelia's question?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to follow up on that, and I have to apologize. I did not see the email Monday about the report, so I haven't had a chance to review the new report. So if I am asking a question that is not relevant because something has changed, please let me know. But what I have heard so far and what I've heard from some preview information that I've heard is that very thing that I put in the chat, is that there's another layer of data that really should be superimposed over this, which has to do with traffic safety infrastructure, traffic patterns, and safety improvements. So that's not to say that people who live in high collision areas, and I think Tia had pointed out that there are signs in some of these intersections, but what I'm not sure of is what is the end result of these stops, because if you're already living in a high collision area because of a lack of investment in a safety corridor or whatever would make it safer, then yes, you're going to be more likely to get into an accident. But there's still a disparity there to be spoken to. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. The one other comment I want to make is some questions I had last year that I don't think were answered satisfactorily. I could say that word. But what was also missing from last year's report was a correlation, without naming specific officers, but was there a disparity in the number of people pulled over based on their perceived identity by officers, or if there's a number that says that most officers pull over the same perceived identities at about the same rates. And last year, I was told that that's not a number that's being looked at and that there is challenges to it. And I think we expressed the fact that we felt that was a critical data point.
If on the individual officers' data, I don't have access to that data, and this report doesn't address it. I think it's a valid question to ask.
That's what I thought. And I still think that's an important data point that we need to look at from an equitable standpoint. That's all the comments I have right now.
Just to your other point, though, about structural issues, why there might be more traffic problems in an area. Yeah, it's absolutely the case, and it could well be an explanatory factor that if you live in a poor area, and if Black and brown people are more likely to live in poor areas, they're more likely to be involved in traffic accidents because of where they live. And if we're policing those areas more heavily, they might be pulled over simply because they live in a high traffic corridor, and that may be a driving factor for why they're being stopped more frequently. That is absolutely a possibility. This report doesn't allow us to know that. I think that's a really interesting avenue to go down to.
Yeah, thank you.
Dan, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, is that all right? Dan Handelman, he, him pronouns, Portland Cop Watch. Mr. McDonald, I appreciate your presentation, but like somebody else mentioned, it feels a lot of the times that these reports are being done to try to excuse the numbers that have been consistently since 2000 showing an over policing of the Black community here, instead of trying to figure out how to make those disparities go away. So find the numbers to make them go away instead of making the over policing go away. So I'm sure you're going to get to this sooner or later, but the focus intervention, because since the FITCOG is here, the focus intervention team's numbers in the 2022 report show that 44% of their stops were with Black people, which is much, much, much higher than the traffic crash data. That was for some reason adjusted down to 37% in the new report.
Is it adjusted or is it for a different period?
Excuse me?
Is it adjusted or is it for a different period?
No, it's the same period. It's just the 2022 report shows 44%. The 2023 report shows that 2022 was 37%. So it was changed for some reason.
Okay.
And then the new data shows that it was 42%. So it's still pretty darn high. So even if 37% was correct last year, it's 42% this year.
Right.
And so that, and this report is remarkable in that it's the first time the police bureau has admitted that the crime rate has nothing to do with traffic stops. Now, I heard you say something a little bit to the contrary of that a few minutes ago, but that is what it says in the report. And I think that there was no real benchmark to use to explain why the focus intervention team stopped so many Black people. I have some other comments, but I'll save them for a little later. But I wonder if you can respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to get into the FIT team. It is a different kind of a fish to the traffic stops. So I would like to separate the two issues. They are quite different. That's a really legitimate set of questions. If you don't mind waiting on the FIT team issues, we'll get to them for sure.
Oh, okay. Well, then let me ask my other question then, which this is more about the broader question. I also heard you mention briefly people driving in from out of town or out of state. Now, you're a statistician. In order for a 6% Black population or even an 18% Black crash data population to have somewhere between 24, which is the patrol people, and 42% stop rate, you'd have to have like 89,000 white people leave Oregon and 89,000 Black people come into Oregon to make those numbers match. Can you explain what the theory is behind people coming in from out of state? And if that is true, can you assure us that there's a way to correlate who's getting stopped with their driver's licenses to make sure whether they live in Portland or Oregon or not?
Well, so let me understand. What I'm looking at here is we have in 2023 for traffic stops, we have Black and African Americans stopped 13% of stops. Now, Black and African American make up 6% of the population, but they make 17% of the injury collision statistics. So what PPB is saying is that we should compare the 13% of Black and African Americans stopped by the traffic division with the 17% of Black and African American who are involved in injury collisions, and that rate is not showing a racial disparity when you compare the rate at which the traffic division stops Black and African American folks with the rate at which those folks are involved in injury traffic collisions. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, but what I'm saying is that all officers, including patrol officers, the rate is 22%, which is higher than the 17% number you just quoted.
So the 22%, I think, is for non-traffic stops. So this is largely.
Oh, it's if you add the patrol officers and the traffic officers together. So the patrol officers are actually higher, I think. I'm looking up the report right now.
So what I would suggest that we do is we don't mix these two groups because they're quite different, right? So the rate at which the FIT team or the non-traffic team, most of which is the FIT team, stops people. There is a disparity in race. So the FIT team and the non-traffic team stops African-American drivers at a higher rate than you would expect based on either their population in the city or their representation in the injury collision data. Is that's what you're saying?
Okay, well, I'm looking at the report now. So yes, I see the 22% is for the non-traffic officers only. So it's not by adding them together. So yes, I guess that, again, the crash data don't have anything to do with the non-traffic officers.
No, because that's not what they're doing. So the FIT team is largely around gun violence. So these are folks who are patrolling. What they're trying to do is prevent gun violence. And they are not stopping people based on high traffic accidents corridors. They're not pulling people over primarily for traffic infractions. My understanding looking at this is that they are largely pulling over people because they are trying to, their mission is to stop people who they think might be involved in gun crime. Now, this gets to the issue of pretext stops. And I think a really interesting question is, a few years ago, the city decided or announced that it was not going to be doing pretext stops. I think it is worth asking the question of, have we changed that policy and are we in fact doing pretext stops? I'm not certain based on this, but I think it's worth asking. It is certainly the case that non-traffic stops, we are stopping Black and African Americans at a higher rate than you would expect, either in the general population or in the injury collision rate data. And my gut feeling about this is that it has something to do with the mission of the FIT team, which is about preventing gun violence, which is a problem which afflicts the Black and African community at a higher rate than the white community. So I think that the police bureau would say that the reason that non-traffic stops are higher is because the mission of interdicting gun violence puts them into contact with Black and African American people more frequently than it does with white people. Now, you might make the case, and I think it's a reasonable question to ask, about how we would disentangle that issue of policing gun violence with the potential issue of over-policing Black and brown communities. I don't think we have the data in this report to be able to, I don't have the data in this report to be able to answer that. It is a legitimate avenue to inquire about, and I think there is reasonable cause for concern. Actually, on page 4, if we look at stop reasons, this report pulls out drivers perceived to be Black African American were significantly more likely to be stopped for non-moving violations by non-traffic personnel than other perceived racial ethnic groups. This has been identified as an area of concern in 4 of the last 5 annual reports. So I think the Police Bureau is in agreement with you that there is something going on that is concerning here around the rate at which we stop Black people, particularly for non-traffic violation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So could I
Oh, you-
suggest, sorry, Odelia, could I suggest that we kind of hand it back to Nick for a second to maybe go through some of the points that you were going to hit, and then, because this is generating so much discussion, and I think we've only hit benchmarking. So I think we definitely want to hear more about the non-traffic stops. And I think there's some other things in there too. So make sure we maybe land there or even go there next. But I think let's hand it back to Nick and kind of, you know, maybe work through some more of that, and then we'll kind of get back into the questions.
Sorry, I was just gonna make the one observation, if I may. And the point of it is the report is higher. And that's the issue of the problem in the report.
Just one thing, because I'm sure a lot of questions will come up, so just write them in the chat and then hopefully we can come back to them after more of a presentation is given and then go through the PCCEP questions too.
Yeah, it's a good idea. All right, go for it, Nick.
Okay, so the other 2 issues here are consent searches. So 2023, we had a decreased number of consent searches. Consent searches is when the officer has no right to, they don't have probable cause to insist on a search. They ask the person they're interacting with, can I search your vehicle or you? And the person has a right then to say yes or no. Drivers perceived to be Black or African American were significantly more likely to receive a consent search request in 2023 when compared to white and Hispanic or Latino subjects. Now, that's concerning. It might reflect the rates at which non-traffic officers stop folks for suspicion of gun crime and they want to carry out a consent search. I'm not in a position to tell you whether that's the right thing they should be doing. It is true that if you're Black or African American, you're more likely to be asked by an officer who stops you whether they have permission to search you. And I understand that as a Black person, you know, you might have different abilities to agree to or decline that search. You might feel like you for various reasons, you know, it's difficult for you to assert your rights. I think this is an area where it would be worth digging in more. I don't think that we have the data here to know whether these consent searches reflect a legitimate policing goal, or whether potentially the rate at which people are being asked whether the police may search them reflects a bias in those requests. And the last thing that I would say about the stop disposition. So stops with probable cause or reasonable suspicion of a non-traffic crime were more predictive of an arrest or no enforcement action when compared to other traffic-based stop reasons. So if an officer pulls you over for an offense which is not primarily traffic related, they are more likely to either arrest you or do nothing as a result of that, which intuitively makes sense to me because these are fit team largely. Yeah. So the other thing I want to talk about is the fit team. Let's get into the fit team, because I think it is useful to really think about these as two separate things. The fit team is not the same in any way as the general traffic policing. So we are seeing this is page 58 for anyone who wants to follow along. Table 49, fit officers stopped significantly more Black African American drivers than other officers from other divisions. So in 2023, the fit team, the focused innovation team, stopped Black and African Americans at a rate of 41%, 42%, which is significantly more than they are either represented in the general population or in the crash data. This report does not allow us to know why this is. It likely, at least in part, relates to their mission around gun violence, which affects the Black and African community more than other parts of the city. I think it's a very valid question to ask whether there are other things going on here. This report doesn't allow us to set that issue to rest, but there is something that that I think is worth chewing on.
All right, more questions? I know there were definitely some questions about the fit team and the non-traffic.
So the other thing here is the issue of pretext stops, right? So pretext stop is where an officer might be interested in stopping someone to search their car for weapons or to run a warrant or something. And so what they will do is they will follow that person around until they make a turn without signaling or something like that, and they will pull them over for the traffic stop on the pretext. But what they really want to do is a chance to ask them if they can search the car or something else. A few years ago, Portland announced that it was not going to be doing pretext stops. This report does not allow us clearly to determine whether they are doing pretext stops. There could be a number of things going on here, but I do think it's a worthwhile question to ask whether we are doing pretext stops. I'm sorry, I key to notice. I can't speak to that particular case. I don't know.
I have a question. Do you do any data on age ranges? And I was just curious about the young people.
I think we do break it out by age. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. There are all kinds of problems with this because of the rate at which either younger people and older people are involved in traffic accidents. So you might expect older people or younger people to be reflected in being pulled over by traffic police more often. We could get into this. At the level at which I've digested this report, I can't speak to it off the top of my head, but we could get into it for sure.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
So one thing I do want to throw out there, and I don't know whether you shared the report, but there was an interesting study that was put out by Stanford in 2020, and I'll post it in the chat. This is not a study about Portland, and it doesn't relate directly to Portland, so I don't want people to interpret it as saying anything about Portland at all. But what Stanford did was they took a bunch of data and they analyzed the same period of time in the same area at times of the year when it was dark and at times when it was day. And the conclusion was that they found was that when it was dark, a lot of the racial disparity in traffic stops disappeared. And they described this as the veil of darkness. And their conclusion was that in the areas that they studied, when officers were not able to see the race of a driver before they pulled them over, some of the racial disparity disappeared. And so their conclusion was that that was one way to tell the degree of racial disparity in the stops data. And to be clear again, this is not an accusation I'm making about PPP. The data currently does not support that. I think it would be fascinating to do this kind of analysis in Portland. I think it might show you, it might throw some light on this issue of whether there are racial bias disparities in the way we stop people.
And just to clarify, when you say the data doesn't support that, that's because the data isn't broken up by day and night, right?
That's correct. Currently, we don't know whether what day. So at 7 o'clock, depending on the type of year, that might be light or dark. So we don't know. If the state did veil of darkness analysis, I haven't seen it. I'd be interested to see it.
Go ahead, Devontae.
All right, thank you. I guess just two questions on my end. So you're saying that based on the data, we can't, it doesn't clearly speak to, we can't clearly ascertain whether or not that pretextual stops are happening, but in the same breath, you could also say that that then means we can't say for certain that they aren't happening. So that's a gray point, gray area at this time.
Yeah. So the fit team stop people, and the non-traffic team, nearly all when the traffic officers stop someone, it is nearly always for a traffic violation. When the non-traffic team stop people, a percentage of the time it is not for a traffic violation. And so the question is, what is the reason for that? This report doesn't have a lot of detail about what those reasons are. It is possible that some proportion of those are pretext stops. The evidence in the report doesn't say. But it's an interesting question to ask.
Okay, and then another question I have is, so we can see that percentages of the stops, by race for Black and brown people compared to other ethnicities or races, but none of this data is broken down by time. So when you were, I guess, kind of accumulating or sifting through this data, there's nothing that speaks to the time of day, since you were getting into the veil of darkness study that was done. None of the data that we have for the city of Portland clarifies what time of day or night that these stops were happening.
Well, we would have that. The police bureau would have that data. All the stops would have the time of day, and we would be able to do that. This report doesn't include it. Gina, do you want to speak to pretextual stops? Because when I was looking at this, it seemed like a couple of years ago the city made an announcement that it was not doing pretextual stops. It sounds like maybe you're saying that is no longer the case.
Oh, the FIT team absolutely is engaging in pretextual stops. It's one of the primary tools used in their focused deterrent strategy. And I would say that it's taken us probably about a year and a half or so to actually put a name to what was happening. So when we get an opportunity, when the time is right in this group and it's our turn to speak, we will speak more to what that is. And we're just also learning the language of pretextual, like to finally put a name to what we're observing. But I would say with very strong confidence that is exactly what is happening. It's not the only thing that's happening, but it is absolutely a strategy that is used.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe you want to talk about that now, because my conclusion from this was that I personally believe that probably pretextual stops are happening. I don't have the evidence to say that definitely, but it sounds like you might.
Yeah. Well, if the definition of pretextual stops, right, is the idea of pulling somebody over initially for a traffic violation, but that's not the reason they're pulling them over. The FIT has information about individuals, but they're not able to pull them over oftentimes because of that information. And there's a variety of complex and nuanced reasons as to what that is. But I know the FIT is doing pretextual stops because they have described in detail exactly the methodology and the thinking that goes into why they pull people over. And it is reflected in the data. I mean, we can see in the data that people are being pulled over by the FIT greater than any other unit, and they're not traffic police. They're pulling people over at a really great rate for traffic violations, but people aren't being cited for traffic violations. And if you look in the data, they're being cited for other things, crimes, usually prostitution, maybe sex trafficking, theft, and obviously anything that might be related to gun violence, whether it's possession of a gun, things like that. And so, so part of our process as the COG has been identifying a tool that can help us assess the types of probable cause, if you will, or reasoning that goes into justifying pulling somebody over, because the stops data is useful to a certain extent, but if you're engaging in a pretextual stop, the stops data isn't going to be a good way to assess if whether or not law enforcement is in fact holding true to the laws, right, around what defines, probable cause, reasonable suspicion, and all of that. And so our job as the COG is to assess the work of the FIT. And what we're finding is that we don't really have a measurement tool that can really look to what the gap between what information they have that leads them to believe that somebody should be pulled over, and then the decision that, okay, we're going to pull this person over because of a traffic stop. And there's a gap, right? We're trying to understand. It's not that there isn't reasoning for it. There is, but PPB doesn't document that reasoning, right? Not in a way that we can at least easily access or understand. And when PPB is asked to provide that in writing, they're not comfortable with that, right? So
page 59 might be handy here. And I just want to be clear. My understanding is that there's no law preventing pretext stops, right? Like a FIT officer, there's no reason why they can't stop somebody for a traffic reason, right? As well as some other reason. That there was an announcement a couple of years ago, a couple of announcements that we were not going to do it, but there's no legal reason why PPB should not be doing it. It is legal to do it.
I posted in the chat just so folks can see too. So the Constitution currently upholds the use of pretextual stops. It's not illegal. And also there might actually be reasons why officers would use a pretextual stop and why it can actually potentially be helpful in certain circumstances. So I also really want to make it clear that by us stating that FIT officers are engaging in pretextual stops doesn't mean that we're inherently against it. But what it does mean is that we have to start looking at what are the appropriate assessment tools to determine what is actually going on when those types of stops happen. So gun violence is a unique issue in the city of Portland, disproportionately impacting communities of color. And so it's a very nuanced topic. And I want to be really clear that there isn't an easy yes or no, like this is a good tool, or methodology of policing to use, or it's not a good tool. The answer is that it's a little bit of both, and it really just depends on how it's being used and how we're able as a community to sort of assess how it's being done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so Stephanie, just thank you for the idea of probable cause. If FIT team had probable cause to stop somebody, they could stop them. If they suspect they have a gun or something that they have probable cause, they could do it anyway. The reason why they would do a pretext stop is because they have a suspicion, but they don't have probable cause. So they wait till you make a right turn without signaling or whatever it is, and then they stop you for that, and then they ask, "Can I search your car?" Is that what you're saying, Stephanie?
No, what I'm saying is that probable cause is required. It doesn't have to be, how do I say this? This is really complicated legal framework. So all the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable search and seizure. And when an officer stops a person, that's considered a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. An officer can stop someone if they have probable cause of any crime. So it doesn't have to necessarily, they don't have to have probable cause for every crime that could be occurring, just one. And then they have the authority, the legal authority to stop a person and to investigate from there.
Yeah, so what happens is that you have someone who you have a suspicion about but not probable cause, and so you follow them around till they make a minor traffic infraction, and then you have the right to stop them and ask to search their car, and that's what a pretext stop is.
Yeah, and a pretext stop, just to kind of underscore what you said, because I think there's some confusion also around this. A pretext stop is exactly what you said, Nick, that they may have knowledge about a person that doesn't necessarily establish probable cause of a certain crime, but they may follow that person and see some kind of crime that occurs that does then give them the ability or the authority to stop that person and continue investigating. Because calling something a pretext stop does not, it's again another kind of term of art. It doesn't mean it's a lie. It doesn't mean it's a false reason. It just means it may be a different reason from what they maybe were hoping to get out of an investigation. But it doesn't mean that there's not probable cause or reasonable suspicion for an officer to stop a person.
No, absolutely. But I think what we're talking about is page 59 here, the table 50. So we have fit officers and the reason for the stop. So it's broken out by traffic reason only, traffic and other crime, and then non-traffic offense only. So the officers are saying that some percentage of the time they stop someone who is driving for a non-traffic offense. Sometimes they stop them for a traffic offense and another crime, and sometimes they stop them for just a traffic offense. And so I think in the context of the fact that the FIT team stops Black and African American people at a greater rate than you might expect by the raw demographics, there is an interesting avenue to pursue here to learn more about what's going on. I don't think from the data we have any cause to make a definitive statement about what's going on here. But I think given the disparities in the data, it's an interesting avenue to ask some more questions about.
And one question I would ask, Nick, because your discussion around how the traffic, crash, those statistical things may frame a basis for those contacts. Can you share a little bit about, you mentioned the disproportionate impact of gun violence for communities of color, particularly the Black and African American community, and do you have, can you speak a little bit to how that may also be sort of another idea of a benchmark that may have something to do with these stops?
Yeah, so I think most people on this call will be aware that gun violence disproportionately affects the Black and African American community in Portland. Black people are significantly more likely to be victims of gun crime. And so it doesn't surprise me that the FIT team is policing those communities or involved in those communities at a higher rate than they would be in the West Hills. I think that, I think we can probably all understand why when gun crime disproportionately affects Black people, the unit of the police who are involved in interdicting gun crime spends more of their time in Black and brown communities. The question that I suspect arises in people's minds is, how do we distinguish the legitimate focus on areas where this crime happens most often from a potential to over-police those communities? And my position there is that is a really reasonable question, and this data currently does not allow us to make that distinction. Is that fair? Does that make sense?
Go ahead, Barb.
Thanks, Dory. I just had like a couple of things on my mind in terms of all of this. One, thank you for saying the page numbers. It's really helping following along. And are you using the same base metric for the non-traffic stops as you are for like the FitCog stops, not non-traffic,
No,
as you
so
are for traffic division? Does that make sense? And then I have one other comment.
it totally makes sense. So no, the injury collision rates are used for the traffic stops. We do not, this report does not benchmark non-traffic stops because they have, they present the idea that there's no way to benchmark the fit stops because we don't entirely know why the fit officers are pulling over particular people. And so we can't choose a control population to say, what would be the expected rate at which they're pulling people over. Does that make sense?
It does, but it leads me to my other two things, which is what do they do everywhere else in terms of benchmarking non-traffic and in terms of benchmarking traffic. And I would argue that there is a flaw in using that. It might be the best thing that you guys can use, but I think that people of wealth are more likely to own cars that are safer, and so they're less likely to get injured in an accident. And they're probably less likely to run away. But,
So I think
the last part, I guess, doesn't make sense. Sorry.
Oh, totally. Well, the issue of other structural issues that make certain people more likely to be involved in traffic accidents than others, I think they probably are. We really can't, from this data, disambiguate that. To the question of, my personal opinion on this, when I read this report, I think for traffic stops data, the injury collision rate is a pretty good benchmark. It allows us to see whether it doesn't allow us to disambiguate these structural things. Maybe there's the state of the roads in some neighborhoods make accidents more likely. That might well subject certain people to systematic disparities. That seems to me less a policing issue, more of a systemic city issue. And this really is about stops rates. I am personally pretty comfortable with the injury collision rate for traffic stops. There are things about the traffic stops that I think it is worth digging into. And on page 4, I think that's highlighted in the report. I think there's agreement from everybody concerned that there are issues to be concerned about. The thing when I read this report that is most interesting to me is the non-traffic stops, and particularly the fit team. And I think when we're at page 59, 58, this is the area where if I was deciding where to spend time asking questions, this perhaps is where I would be spending most of my time, because I think I don't want to tell you that this report tells us that there are systemic racial disparities in the way the fit team is behaving. But I do want to say that this report does not allow us to conclude that there are not. So that would be, if I was giving you advice, I would spend most of my time asking questions around the non-traffic stops, particularly around the fit team. And to be clear, I am not saying that there is malfeasance going on here on the basis of this data. It does not allow us to say that.
Thanks, Nick. So I put this in the chat, but we're going to get through the remaining hands up, and then we'll have to move on to our next agenda item, which is very related to everything we've been talking about. But just keep that in mind. And go ahead, Devante.
You're muted.
You are muted.
Sorry, I'm juggling a couple different screens here, so I apologize for being a bit discombobulated. So I hope that I'm getting this correct, because when you were speaking a little while ago, Nick, you mentioned that there is a piece of data that is not indicated in this stops data report, and you said that maybe it's possible because Portland Police Bureau just doesn't feel comfortable including that data. And to me, I think that even if we're looking at, or we're thinking that, there's a higher percentage of pretextual stops for Black and Brown people, because Black and Brown people have a higher probability of being or falling victim to gun violence. So that's why they're being stopped and examined for whether or not they potentially have guns in their vehicle. I think that that's kind of like contradictory to what we're saying. We're trying to protect Black and Brown people because they fall victim at higher rates. But the reason that we're stopping them is potentially to arrest or cite these people for not adhering to the law. So I mean, it's not illegal, but I think it's certainly like immoral, because what we're literally describing is racial profiling, right? We're assuming that because Black and Brown people, are Black and Brown people, that and they fall victim to gun violence at a higher rate, that we can use, a traffic violation as a pretext to then examine if they are, doing these other things. And it's a fit team specifically that's doing this. So, and none of this data really is clarified in the stops data report, but we do know that the number has increased to, I think you guys said 42%, this year. So I think that that's like the huge issue for me. It, I mean, it just sounds like racial profiling is literally what we're describing here, but that's just not the language that anyone wants to use.
Well, I do, I definitely hear those concerns. That is not what I'm saying, to be clear. To me, when I hear racial profiling, I hear that like, well, we are stopping somebody because they are Black or brown. And I think that is not the argument that's being made here. I think that the argument being made is that the plurality of gun crime in the city is committed by Black and Brown people against Black and Brown people. Now, I am not in any way saying, what am I saying here? Because that is true, I think PPB would say that it is appropriate for the FIT team, when they're making their investigations, that those investigations fall more heavily in those communities. I don't think that's the same as racial profiling, but I totally understand why that's concerning. I think a lot of this comes to the policies about how we want to police our communities, and I can't tell you how you should want to do that. I think that the data here shows that the FIT team is pulling over Black and Brown people at a higher rate than you would expect across a number of benchmarks. It is perfectly, there's nothing in this report that suggests what they're doing is illegal or, to my mind, immoral. It may well be not the way the community wants them to be doing that. And that, to me, is a decision for you all to make, not for me. But that is, certainly an avenue that is worth, pursuing as we, as a city, decide how we want to conduct policing in these areas.
Yeah, I totally understand that, and I do understand get that perspective. But I mean, racial profiling is usually literally the use of race or ethnicity as grounds for suspecting someone of having committed an offense. So if the pretext stops are occurring, and I know that that's not the argument that's being made, but I'm saying that that's what the data is clearly indicating. I think that you're right. There's definitely a conversation that we should probably have. And
yeah, the only thing that I would say about that is that I think that the FIT team would say they're not pulling over somebody because they're Black or brown. They're pulling them over because they suspect them of gun crime and they happen to be Black or brown.
Because, yeah, but I mean, we kind of already said that, and that's where we kind of run into that circle. But they just happen to be Black or brown, right? That's the whole pretext of we're pulling them over for the traffic violation that you're indicating.
Yeah, but I'm not saying that they're pulling them over because they're Black. I'm saying that they're.
No, I know that's not. I know. I mean, no, I wouldn't expect that you would ever say that, or you're just here to interpret the data and help us to understand it. So I'm not saying that you have any of these beliefs or stances. But what I'm saying is that the data is. I mean, yeah, you can call it racial discrimination, but I just don't see how it's different than if you look at the definition of racial profiling, how that's different. And I know that maybe that's semantics, but
well, no, I think it's not semantic. I think it's really important, right? Because on the one hand, if we're pulling people over because they're Black, that's a real problem. if we're pulling them over because we suspect them of being involved with gun crime, and it is also a fact that more Black people are involved with gun crime, I think that is different than if we're pulling them over simply because they're Black.
Yeah, I think this conversation may continue when we hear from the FitCog, because I think this is exactly kind of what they've been exploring with their group. But yeah, I think really good points, Devontae. Yeah, this is I'm handing it to myself, I guess, but I just had a really it's never happened before. I had a really quick clarifying question, possibly for Mary Claire or Stephanie. I put in the chat a couple of times, a few links. PPB has said they've recommended to themselves internally, and then I think Chief Lavelle at the time sort of announced that the Bureau would no longer be performing pretext stops. I think that was maybe back in 2021, and then another report in 2023. Because they can undermine a sense of procedural justice. But it does not seem that there's any formal policy in place about not performing pretext stops. Is that accurate? There is no policy that says PBB doesn't do them?
My understanding, having looked into this, that there is no policy preventing it. There's a law preventing it. There were 2 announcements made in 2021 around
Correct.
that time.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure. I wanted to ask Mary Claire or possibly Stephanie and confirm that.
I think Nick's right.
Okay. Yeah. Just wanted to make sure we weren't missing anything. Okay. That was my question.
Just one more on top of that. Sorry, Carrie, but is because that was in the conversation, is that still in the conversation? Has that been brought up recently in PPB, or has that been put on pause? If anyone can answer that from the Bureau.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite clear what the question was.
Oh, just like because this was a conversation that maybe the Bureau would stop doing pretext stops, and has there been conversation recently since 2021 about putting this in a directive or into city law that the Bureau will not engage in pretext stops?
I have not been in conversations about that, but I'm happy to look into it and report back.
I think he gave his directive then, and I don't believe we've had any, conversations about.
Okay, sorry, Carrie. Totally cut you in line, but go ahead, please.
All right, Carrie, I think you'll close it out for us here, and we can move on to the members of the FitCog who are graciously waiting on us. Go ahead.
Okay, so real quick, I think the question has been answered, but because the non-stop traffic data wasn't broken down by the type of unit, I was questioning that before this meeting, but it seems like from the fit data, that's where it's coming from. I can assume that that's the majority of the non-traffic stops, which I think you already answered before. Just wanted to clarify that. My other question was on the bottom of page 19, there are 2 lines in that bottom paragraph that say, conversely, a driver being perceived to be Black African-American was the strongest predictor of receiving only a warning. This is the first time in a PPB stops annual report that it has been revealed that an individual race ethnic group has differed significantly compared to white individuals, so results should be interpreted with caution. What I could interpret that a few ways. Yeah, is the data being revealed for the first time because it's a new trend, or because they didn't track it before? And how should we be cautious about interpreting it? Thank you.
I'm not sure. I would have to go back to previous reports to know whether they did this analysis and didn't find a difference, or whether they have not done this analysis before. I don't have any more insight about this than is in the plain language of the report there. When the traffic division stops somebody, the strongest predictor of a citation is that they're stopped for dangerous driving, which makes sense to me. So that they issue a citation more often when the reason for pulling them over is dangerous driving than, for example, a non-moving violation. So if I'm parked over a driveway, I'm more likely not to get a citation than if I'm speeding, which intuitively makes sense to me. So also, a driver perceived to be Black or African American is the strongest predictor of receiving only a warning. It seems like the traffic division is giving warnings to African Americans at higher levels when they might cite other races. I don't know what to do with this. This might be a real trend. It might also be a statistical anomaly. I think what SSD is saying in that comment is that there's a certain amount of randomness in the data. It may well be that this is random. It might be, if it shows up next year as well, this might be something that's of concern. I think they're saying at this point that it's just correlation or causation. It could be random. If it's worth following it to see if it's a trend, but also sometimes just random stuff happens in the numbers.
All right. Well, that was a really great discussion. Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. I think PCCEP is going to generate a lot of avenues that you are probably going to want to explore a little bit more. And so,
well, thanks for your patience. I'm more than happy to come back, or if I can be of any help on like defragging some of this stuff. It's a dense report, a lot of gnarly issues. I appreciate your time and effort into it.
Absolutely. No, we appreciate your time and help so
Thank
much.
you.
This is the third year that I've been involved in kind of trying to engage with the stops data, and it is such a dense and challenging document. And so I think this is by far the most productive initial meeting we've ever had on it. So plenty more to tease out, but we really, really appreciate your help. Thanks so much, Nick.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Take care. Alrighty, so I think Tia, I'm gonna pass it back over to you to introduce our next item, and we'll get those slides up.
Great. Thank you, Nick, for being here. And now we're going to move on to the end of our committee discussion with FitCog coming. Thank you all FitCog members who's here. Can you please talk on your work with PPB and the stop data? And let's see, I'm looking for names here. Trish Garner, Gina Ronning, whoever would like to move forward with this section. Kimberly Dixon, Precious Brian, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
and I want to address some of the topics that have come up, and then I want to delegate to fellow COG members to elaborate and share other thoughts. We are a collective that share in a single mission, but we don't always necessarily see the picture in the exact same way. So I think it'll be helpful to hear the perspectives of different folks in the group. I think what can be helpful to understand is that the FIT in particular operates from a place, from a strategy known as focused deterrence. I don't know if you all have been familiar with that term. It's a term that we ourselves have been trying to learn and understand. I'm posting a definition of it in the chat so that you can see. But essentially, data-driven policing is an element of focused deterrence, which allows officers to gather a wide variety of information, and they use that information to drive their investigations and their stops. And in theory, what it's supposed to do is help reduce arbitrary or discretionary stops. And I think what was interesting for us in the COG at the very beginning is that I don't know that any of us really fully understood what that meant. And we're just now kind of realizing that the word data can mean a lot of different things. And so our goal for this evening is to share a couple of things that we think will help you just have greater context for the information of the FIT, right? So just keep in mind that as the FIT COG, the only part of PPB that we're charged of looking at and assessing is the work of the FIT. So we don't really, I mean, at times we might look at things beyond the FIT if it's relevant to the work that they're doing, but predominantly we're just focused on their work. A good majority of our time as the COG in the earlier years, when we first started a couple of years back, was even just simply trying to learn these terms, right? I think somebody in this group mentioned we're not data analysts, a lot of us, right? We're laymen. And so like trying to understand the language, the terminology, policing methodology, and just sort of getting crash course lessons on like what all of this means and trying to make sense of how to assess it based on the mission of the COG. So a couple of things that we want to share with you are one, the data in the STOPS report regarding the FIT is different in like sort of in 2020 and 2022, and then you kind of see a shift starting in 2023. And we can provide some context that might help explain why that shift has occurred. And we'll talk a little bit about pretextual stops and why I feel that the consensus is coming in our group that is in fact what is happening, just based on the fact that FIT members have told us very directly that they use traffic stops to pull people over when they have every intention of pulling them over for another reason. If that's not the definition of a pretextual stop, I don't know what is, but that's what we've been told repeatedly and on numerous occasions. And it's because of that, actually, that we're in the current conversations that we are in now regarding how do we assess the work that they're doing based on that information. The other thing we want to share with you is a little bit about the difference between the terms data versus information as it pertains to the FIT and how they use it, what it is and how they use it, and sharing a little bit about the contextual gaps between sort of what the STOPS data report, and I feel like the presentation that you just had kind of addresses this a bit. So I think we're just going to be echoing some of the similar questions that kind of arise around what the data report kind of indicates or doesn't indicate and sort of those gaps. And then also for us as the COG, kind of what this means in our work, which is ultimately leading to the need of a new assessment or measurement tool so that we can more appropriately examine what it is exactly that the FIT is doing on the ground. So I'm going to start and then I'll share a little bit of background and then I want to open it up to other COG members to add or expand or offer different thoughts as well. So in early 2020, you know, the COG was formed in the height of peaking gun violence crisis in Portland, which has been and continues to disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities. And at the time, to our understanding, based on what FIT officers have shared with us and the leadership that existed at that time, is that the official sort of data-driven model wasn't in the way that we, I think, as community members kind of were envisioning it, wasn't in place quite yet. And so the model or the methodology that they were using at the very beginning was something called hotspot policing. And that's a type of data, but hotspot policing, if you're not familiar with that, right, is the idea that there are areas that are statistically showing to have higher rates of gun violence. And so what that does is that police then increase patrols and presence in those communities. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of data-driven stops that was happening. They were doing discretionary stops, period. They admitted that, they acknowledged it, and they explained the reasoning as to why that was happening. And one of the primary reasons why that was happening is that with the abolishment of the GVRT, so the Gang Violence Response Team, one of the things that left with that group was the collective knowledge among those members, right? So when you think about information-based policing, you're talking about things like knowledge of the community, knowledge of the individuals and their histories that are living there, conflicts that are going on, moving beyond just sort of criminal profiling of individuals, but really sort of the community information, the community context that's sort of shaping the environment in those areas. And when GVRT was disbanded, a good majority of community policing resides in oral history. And when the GVRT was disbanded, one of the side effects of that was just sort of the loss of that data. Like officers moved on, there's high turnover rates, they're gone, they move out, you have new officers coming in. Some of them don't live in the communities that they're serving. They don't have the history, they don't have the knowledge. And so the information that, if you will, that would maybe traditionally be used for more information-driven policing wasn't there. PPB didn't have it. They don't have a repository for historical information in this context. So while that's not the only reason, that was a really huge contributing factor to sort of the statistics for pullovers that you see in the earlier part of the FIT's existence in the data in the report, because they were engaging in hotspot policing. Then as we move into sort of 2020, end of 2022 and 2023, FIT has undergone new leadership and they've been around a while, and the information in the community is starting to be rebuilt. The repository of information in the oral history is being reshaped and reformed, and it's allowing FIT officers to engage in a more strategic, data-driven manner. And so you'll start to see the numbers sort of shift based on that leadership and the direction. And also just sort of the context, the climate at the time within the city was shifting as well. The landscape, if you will, was shifting. And so FIT's mission directives were shifting with it. And so the FIT has been evolving to sort of try to meet the needs of what Portland is wanting to have addressing gun violence. But I think it's really, really important to just know that data-driven policing and focused deterrence are the primary methodologies that PPB utilizes. And so when we critique some of the methods that are used, or we're looking at these methods, you just need to know that it's rooted in that overall methodology, right? So if you, for example, if you say, we don't want pretextual policing, that we just think that there's potential for harm and maybe that's not the right approach, you're going to have to look at the overall methodology. Like, you can't just isolate pretextual policing strategies out of context from the greater methodology, because you have to understand that there are a series of tools that police use and they're all interrelated, and it's complicated. So it's one of the reasons why that we in the COG have been spending so much time trying to understand all of the important ways that police intercept violence, and we're still learning. So I hope that's useful. The thing about data and information, so this was just a helpful semantics thing for us. Not all of us, but I think many of us in the beginning had just assumed, because PPB, to be honest, was using the term data-driven policing, and we realized that we never actually had an explicit conversation with them about what constitutes data. And based on the way it was being described, I think there were a lot of us in the community that took that to mean that it was case-based driven stops, meaning that it was evidence based on specific cases rather than like larger statistical data. And that was an inaccurate understanding of data-driven policing. So data-driven policing, just generally speaking, refers to any kind of data that police might have at their disposal that informs a stop, that is rooted in some kind of concrete information, whether it's statistical data or whether it's case-based information. So data is a general term that is an umbrella term to kind of describe any kind of information that's not discretionary, okay? And then information is specific kind of data that is more case-based, right? It will be specifically related to an investigation of a particular person or crime, and there's usually evidence or, reasonable suspicion or probable cause associated with that information. And that's where the pretextual policing strategies come in, is that PPB, particularly the FIT, will have very specific information, right? So I really want to clarify that as the COG, because we are privy to information, some of which we cannot share with you because we are bound under an NDA, which makes us a little bit unique as an oversight group, is that we are privy to confidential information that is case-based. And so we go into a lot of detail with PPB on very specific stops. And we do get to question them about, why did you pull this specific person over? What did you recover? What did you find? What was your reasoning? And we do assess that through our confidential sessions. But that being said, there are still moments, right, where PPB is acknowledging in some of those meetings that it is, I mean, they don't call it pretextual policing, and they've never used that term. I want to be really clear. That's a term that I'm using to describe what ultimately seems like this is a strategy that is being utilized. So I hope that's helpful. So that's the difference between data and information, which has made things a little bit confusing, I think, for us in the COG, because I think for us, where our desire to assess, right, is how do we really understand how do we make sure that the reasoning that PPB is, engaging in these traffic stops is sound? How do we know that? We know that based on a lot of the conversations and the things that they have shared with us, things very much feel like on the up and up, right? Like we haven't encountered any alarming sort of overt behavior that would really question as to whether or not, they're not arbitrarily pulling people over. PPB, FIT in particular, has a very good record of keeping sort of track of, their reasoning. But a lot of this reasoning that they give us is an oral history. So when it comes to sort of the continuity of accountability and just being able to sort of fill in these contextual gaps with the data, that is where we're lacking, right? So we don't account for every single case. We don't have information on every single stop that maybe we would like to. And so I think this is an area where, as the COG, we're trying to figure out, how do we assess? Because we recognize that the stops data does not capture the full extent of what the FIT is doing, for better or for worse, right? Like there are real explanations as to why some of those numbers are what they are, but the stops data doesn't provide you the contextual information, and there's no tool that really allows it. So, one of the things that we recently just asked FIT, we were exploring a potential recommendation, which was, could you start providing us with a discussion, a written qualitative contextual piece of information that is like an addendum to the stops data report, so that we in the community could have a better understanding of what is going on. And I'll be honest with you that the general response of that request was, one, FIT isn't too thrilled with stops data because they don't feel that it really reflects the work that they do, number one. Number two, they're very hesitant to put anything in writing because an internal, third-party department of PPB is responsible for creating and publishing the stops data, and they're not allowed, FIT officers are not allowed to sort of provide their input or explanation as to why they think the data is what it is, because they're not numbers analysts and they're not allowed to assume causality because they're not numbers experts. And so they're just simply not allowed to provide that information. Do with that information as you will. I think that us as COG members, we have found that we think there is value in officers who are on the ground doing the work, providing input about what it is that they're doing. I think it's really interesting that a third-party department that has no direct stake in the matter on the ground, they're not engaging, they're not seeing, the things that the FIT is seeing, gets to have sort of the total and absolute explanation as to what's happening. So one of the things that we're wanting to do is to address those contextual gaps. Is we're exploring what a new tool, a data tool, an assessment tool, a measurement tool, I don't know what we want to call it yet, but something that would allow us a closer look at what is informing these stops and the reasoning behind it. It's very complicated. We have tried on numerous occasions for PPB to sort of explain, and there's just so many legal structures that also define what an officer can, determine as reasonable suspicion or not. There are elements of data-driven policing that are still discretionary, which was another misnomer. I think a lot of us had assumed that data-driven policing meant that there was no discretion, and that's not true either. There absolutely is discretion, but the discretion is grounded in more information rather than what has happened in previous times where there were more arbitrary stops that were not grounded in any kind of data. But I think it's fair to say that we do not have an analytical report that is qualitative in nature that can really explain some of these questions that you're exploring and that we're exploring, I think, alongside of you with some of those questions. So that's the general overview. And then I want to go ahead and open it up to Kim, Trish, and Precious, if you have anything else you'd like to elaborate on or share.
Wow.
Well, good evening, everybody. That's a lot to digest, and hopefully you're taking some really great notes, and you will join us at one of our meetings. Open invitation. A couple of things that I would like to highlight is to draw your attention to, first of all, the mission statements, if you've never read them, for both FIT and FitCog. I think those are highly important. I'm just going to read the first sentence. For the FIT team, the mission of the FIT team is to interrupt and deter gun violence, often involving high-risk individuals. And for FitCog, our mission is to work closely with the commissioner in charge of the Portland Police Bureau, the leadership of PPB, and FIT members and command to understand, inform, and provide recommendations to the city's efforts to reduce gun violence in Portland. So I want to center our understanding based upon what we are here for, what we're designed to do. The other thing that I'm going to refer to is, if you look on PPB's, I think they call it public tableau.com, the shooting incident statistics is what I'm looking at for January 2019 through August 2024. And the reason why these are important, we were formed as the COG June of 2021. And we spent the first 6 months really designing ourselves with our bylaws, our community agreements, and specifically diving into what are we looking for in terms of setting up this team. And that was in partnership with PPB, and specifically drilling into, and what distinguishes that fact that we were not setting up GVRT 2.0. That's not what we were doing. And just even in our actions, we've demonstrated that that's not what we were doing. But we were very specific. We were very involved, to include with the recruitment, with the even the questions that were being asked of the individuals that were applying. And I will also state that the first go run that was really void of our input really kind of fell flat. And what came out of that is the fact that folks wanted to know who was going to be their leadership. And so that was something that was internally rectified, and leadership was established, and we have who we have today. So I also wanted to point that out. But when you look at these shooting incident statistics, in 2019, we were at 276 shooting incidents. When we were set up, it was 850 shooting incidents. As of 2022, it was 898, 2023, 727, and 2024, as of August of this year, 572. When you distill that, because you can distill that to homicide, non-fatal injury, and non-injury, the homicides that were experienced went from 16 in 2019, 20 in 2020, 39 in 21, 51 in 22, 39 in 23, and we are currently at 35. You know what I don't see in any of the statistics that I've read so far? The number of funerals. We don't have that statistic right now. And how many of these funerals are involving the Black and Brown community? What I can tell you is, it's too many. It's too many. So I provide that backdrop to center the conversation regarding stops, regarding who's doing what, because we do have a disparity. We have folks, and I'm just going to be very, very blunt here, that are hunting one another. And we as community have to look at that. Just like I just read these statistics, we have to look at that. And we have to be able to discuss that and have that as a transparency of that lays over all of the other information. And when we look at data, one of the things that I think anybody who's done any kind of research, we all recognize that there might be something missing, and we need to try and figure out what might that something be. But I wanted to provide that information, as well as one of the things that hasn't been discussed, I did put it in the chat, is there was the development of a partnership with Ceasefire. And Stephanie, I know she can go very much into that, and FIT. And that is part of that backdrop that Gina so eloquently described in terms of the data-driven, focused deterrence methodologies and approach that FIT has been using. So hopefully that was a little bit, or maybe a lot of it. There you go.
Yeah, this is Trish Garner. Wow, what an incredible conversation. I really appreciate it. Clearly you're well informed, you're thinking individuals. It is a real pleasure to hear an exchange of thoughts, ideas, information, and so on. I agree. I think Gina gave an incredible summary. We started exactly where Kimberly was talking about. There was a crisis in communities of color. And to say, well, we're not going to look at that, I think would have been a disservice to all the Black and brown people who were killed or going to be killed by firearms violence. Now, that does not justify just, going in, guns blaring, and, we're just going to do what we're going to do. And this is not a replacement for the gang enforcement unit, where I personally believe there are a lot of excesses. FIT, I believe, has been very much attempting to, okay, what's a case here? We've heard so-and-so knew so-and-so, and he might have, been a member of a certain gang. Well, but that car is registered to the person who knew that. I know I'm being somewhat convoluted, but that's how probable cause is established. Who knew what? Who was driving what? Who's reported to have a gun? These aren't like, someone going to the police saying, I saw Joe, with a handgun. They're informal conversations, obviously some formal confrontation with the results of gun violence. But all those go into what is probable cause. Again, just because I say probable cause doesn't mean it excuses anything. I also, when people are talking about pretextual stops, and I believe Dan Handelman gave a citation to the report that I think the 2021 decision about that pretextual stops. I urge everyone to read it. It's not quite what, one might think. It's not, there are no more pretextual stops. We have to be aware of unreasonable stops and just stopping for no reason whatsoever. There have to be things like probable cause, reasonable suspicion, etc. So anyway, I do think that answers a lot of the questions about pretextual stops, but there's no doubt about it. If we're talking about a pretext being information that person X has a gun that was used in a shooting incident, that's the kind of fact that's going to go into probable cause. And I think as the FIT officers have gotten to know the neighborhoods, know the people, I think their attention to that kind of information has caused a lot of community members to share information. I think, you may be well aware, when shootings happen and so on, it's very hard. It's very hard for a community member to step forward and say, hey, you know, so-and-so had a gun, or I think he might have had something to do with it. Or she's dating someone who seems to be, you know, those kind of bits of information are critically important. But and they accumulate. So I hope I'm not rambling here. This is a huge topic. As Gina said, we're really trying to hone in on, okay, you can say probable cause, and that's a broad concept, but what do you really mean by that? So anyway, hopefully this has been helpful. We're attentive to the issues that you brought up here. Keep on bringing them up. And thank you so much for, you know, being interested in the FitCog. Thanks.
Thank you, Trish. I'm not sure if other folks have questions. I don't know what your timeline is, but we're certainly open to answering questions if you have some.
Yep, PCCEP or other folks, any questions for what FitCog members have shared? And I know we have a fourth FitCog member here as well. I didn't know if you were gonna speak, Precious. Okay,
I think
just wanted to make sure
Oh.
we were good to move on. Okay, cool. Go ahead, Odelia.
Yeah, I guess like I have so many questions and a lot to learn still. And like, I think my question is just like keeping this dialogue open and learning from what you all have already been doing for a lot longer than the amount of time we've looked into this. And so like continuing to learn from you all, and also like I know that your work is very particular to fit, but I think like PCCEP has like a broader range of things to focus on in terms of pre-text stops, in terms of other things like that. And so when I guess like and again, like there's 10 minutes left in our meeting, so not a right now question, but would love to hear like where you all think we're getting our questions right or wrong, and like kind of what's missing from our questions and what we're looking into, not just in terms of fit, but in terms of like stops data in general. So that, I guess you all don't have to answer that right now because that was a huge question. So we can move on to Pastor, or I guess to I don't know, Dory, you do this, but if you all have anything briefly to say to that, no worries if not.
I did have a question. That's okay.
Sure, I guess we can hear from both the chairs first and then assume some order after that. Go ahead, Tia.
Well, I was just throughout the whole conversation was thinking, what can PCCEP do with the concerns we hear? And what can we do to move forward with FitCog? I know in the past PCCEP has talked about and questioned, can we abolish searches? But then hearing from Gina and talking about really knowing, we can't take away one thing without really knowing all the methodologies. Is that something that would ever come into play of abolishing searches? And there really isn't such thing as consent searches, it seems like.
I think these questions are really important, and I think that the struggle is, right? And I want to make this clear. I speak for myself, but I view the work of the COG as harm reduction, right? Like in my mind, in the place that I come from, I would love it if we didn't need all of this with policing. But the reality is, right? And I appreciate all the articles that Dan you push, put on there. And I think you're always so reliable on like really always giving us those critical questions. But there is something that also happens, right, in these discussions that we risk, the dehumanization. Like when we talk about crime wave, what we're talking about is murder, right? So, and maybe some of us COG members are just a little bit sensitive because part of our role is we go on ride-alongs. And my ride-along involved being a first responder to a murder scene where the victim, the witness, had blood splatter and brain matter all over their body while we arrived. And so many of us, and we've got members on our team that have lost loved ones to gun violence in this city. So we have a very different perspective, I think, about the seriousness about what's going on the streets of Portland. And so the reality is that we do have people in Portland who are methodical in wanting to murder other people. I think I do really want to amplify a bit of what Kim was kind of highlighting, is that I think, and this is my ask of PCCEP, is that to just try to hold the balance. You're doing an amazing and important job of asking really important critical questions. And I would really love to see oversight groups and advisory groups work closer together. I think because we are sharing a lot of the same goals, and I think we can learn from each other. But I think it's not helpful, I think, at times when we say, police never do this or never do that for crime or whatnot, because there are people who have been victims of crime, who have needs that need to be met that aren't currently being addressed by the system in either direction. And so the answers that we're seeking are just, they're nuanced, right? The reality is that Black and brown people are disproportionately being impacted by both gun violence and also policing. Like, both can be true at the same time. And that is the dilemma that we face. And so our goal in the COG is to figure out ways for the FIT to help address this issue. One of the things that FIT does is actually, I'm never going to sit here and claim that FIT is going to end the long-term issues or root causes of violence. That is ridiculous. I think we know that policing does not address long-term root causes of violence. It doesn't. We have never said that, and we will never say that. But what it will do is it will interrupt cases of violence, particularly retaliatory violence, which is one of the #1 types of gun violence types that impact Black and brown communities. And so we have to also take into context the goal of what the FIT is designed to do. And then how do we reduce harm in what they're doing? Searches, I think, also are different. I think it's important to understand that while the FIT is part of a larger context of PPB, they're part of PPB, but they do operate differently, and their strategies are different. And I will tell you this, that especially currently under the current leadership, I really actually think you should speak with Lieutenant Hill if you get an opportunity, and some of the new members of the FIT team. I think you would be very impressed and actually blown away about some of the things that they believe and the things that they're working for. Lieutenant Hill is he is deeply immersed in the community that he serves, and he's lived here for a very long time. He's very well respected in the community, and I really respect a lot of the perspective that he has, and he certainly brings a new perspective to the table, ones that we weren't getting before his leadership. I'm going to be real honest with you about that. And so I think that you'll see that that we're in an opportune time for change in policing, and that some of your questions, I think some members, not all, but some members of PPB, I think, would be really open to having those conversations with you and talking about the realities of some of the crime and where searches, for example, are helpful and maybe where they're not. That was a really long-winded way, but I just feel like you all should have some of that context.
That's great. I appreciate everything you just said. Thank you.
Yeah, super interesting to think about how these issues surface for both groups, but kind of play out differently based on our different charges and different goals of the group. So yeah, super interesting discussion here. So I'm just gonna give everyone a heads up. We're probably gonna run a little bit long tonight, but that's just because we've been generating so many good questions. 7:57, we have 4 hands, and we also have open public comment. So let's get through these hands and see where we are. And yeah, go ahead, Pastor Weisner.
I think I might be too old to ask this question in the room because it's like killing the kumbaya. Dr. Gina, always excellent. Team, FIT, excellent. passion, everything you said. Drawing back to the topic of the conversation, Gina, there is a difference. I know that you would like, I was hoping that you can explain to me, we've had conversations before in this, but in the areas of what it is under the content of documenting the stops and reporting the stops compared to the methodology of the reason or the rhyme of the stops in itself. The team fit does have, and I think in the report and differences, is that there was a focus of not pulling or making stops for certain reasons. And it kind of spiked it up and then it spiked it down, whatever that reason for it, because they felt that they were all able to do the stops. And the Bureau decided under the leadership that the officers felt that they should be able to do stops. I'm trying to get to the point of where that when the differences, when they're doing stops and being asked to do stolen cars stops and mixing it up in the areas of what they do in the content of stops that's designed under the fit stops, but it's all the same because they're able to do stops. My question is in areas of what is not documented thoroughly through history, Chief Foxworth had put forth from every stop the reasons for stops, as well as defining the stops under the descriptions of what the stops were for the data report. So I'm not sure why there was a missing information of purpose of stop and data tracking it, reason why, because it definitely was there. But now it sounds like you're saying that it's not there. I don't know where and what. But then again, with the settlement, maybe Stephanie or I'm sorry, Mary Beth is here, or Mary Claire could help us understand that in the data that's collecting and separating from the information system where officers, supervisors are needing to make sure that these documents are being reasonable and understood through clear documentations on their stops, it still seems like it's not occurring. And I don't know why we're saying that we can't figure this out. So my question goes back to, is it fair to say that they're saying that they can't document it on the reason for the stop because of the type of stops that they're doing? I don't understand that part.
Yeah, it's a good question. So each week when we meet with the FIT, they give us a FIT report, and it's or what's called a FIT summary, and it will be a very brief summary about the stops. Usually, Kim, what would you say? What is the time frame of the FIT summary from like the previous meeting? Is it usually bi-weekly? Is the summary?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're getting bi-weekly summaries of stops. They're just not very detailed is the thing. So they are documenting it. And I mean, I think we're needing to get clarity, and maybe Kim can provide us with some expansion on this. But my understanding is, they do write police reports and there's that information. I don't know where that information goes. We get limited information. And we certainly, if we ask PPB, if we ask the FIT verbally questions and we ask them to expand upon a stop, I mean, they'll share it with us. They will tell us, we'll go into a confidential session and we'll break into some of that detail. But it's not always clear. And I don't know that we're always getting and I want to be really clear that this is not to say that PPB is doing anything nefarious or wrong. I will just say what I'm witnessing, this is my perception. PPB is very knowledgeable about the ins and outs and the daily work that they do, but they're terrible at communicating about it. I'm just going to be real. I mean, we've talked about forever about, do you guys have somebody whose sole job it is just literally to communicate what you're doing to the rest of us? Because they don't know how to communicate what they're doing. Other than one of our members at the last meeting was talking about You know, this is all very academic and intellectual, like all of the data, all the percentages, and it's not very tangible for the everyday layman, right? To like really wrap their brains around like what you're doing and how you're doing it. And so I believe the information is there. I don't think it's that the information doesn't exist. I just don't think it's being collected and stored in an easily continuous way, right? Where we can easily go to it and refer to it and look back on it. And I don't think the data that they give us in the summaries is as detailed. And when we do get those details, it's really only in the form of oral reporting. And when we ask them to provide more information in writing, they don't want to do it. And they've explained why, like, you know, they're not really allowed to because of the rules around data reporting and the PPB. And I also think that they're afraid that if they say something and they're wrong, the public is going to really hold their feet to the fire on that, and they're going to get stuck there. And that's a fair concern, because I think the public absolutely would do that. So I don't know how we meet them in the middle around their concerns, but also the need of community to have this information in a more understandable way. But I think the information can be captured in the police reports that they're doing. They must know the reasoning as to why stops are happening if they can verbally articulate that to us on a case by case. And what we're asking for is that we would like that the verbal information that they kind of give us and explaining it, we would like it in a more consistent, or not consistent, well, consistent, yes, but a more a way that we can kind of refer back to it, right? It's really hard to keep track of oral history, especially as leadership changes and as membership in the COG changes, right? It's like, oh, what was said in that meeting? You know, can we remember? And like, it's, you know, the summaries are very limited. I hope that, I know it doesn't answer your question.
No, it does. It does, Gina. The only thing that I would put on record is this, is that you're the COG. That's why your existence. That's why the reports, anything that comes to your what you guys do, they should be able to get it to you, for that was the reason for its existence. The last comment that I would make, again, the partnership with PCCEP and the COG and its building relationship. If it can't get done, then that's where the agreement of recommendation comes back to a community forum and understand why. And we're saying, again, we want better policing. My old way of watching and looking things is Keaton Otis being the prime example. There was an information system that went and moved out of the regular system to communicate to a different system for record and tracking and following it. But because of too many systems, there is where we are right now. And I think someone said fairly enough that transparency is what this is basically about. We believe we could get better policing. And I want to shout out to Lieutenant Hill, because definitely he is definitely someone that is doing and is the right person for this team. That's my last comment. And I seen Stephanie put her, hi, Steph.
Hi.
And
I think
if I
is
go
probably, yeah, I was going to have Trish go because I think she probably wants to say something similar to me. So go ahead, Trish.
Yeah, firstly, those are excellent comments. And what I want to reiterate is that's what we're trying to do. What kind of information? What type of information? In other words, we're not going to be able, excuse me, to get each and every fact. But what are the types of questions we need to know what to ask? Also, it's complicated by the fact that, as Kimberly mentioned, you know, many of these are active investigations. And, you know, we need to be cognizant that that's, you know, we need to make sure that that's true. And it is true in many cases. There's also the problem of once, you know, a police make a assertion of fact about a case, that's immediately something that's on the public record. It's discoverable by, you know, everybody in the criminal system and outside of the criminal system. Now, that's not going to stop us from doing what we want to do. I'm saying that officers, I think, struggle with, okay, what can we say that meets the needs of the community to know what we're doing, but doesn't impede active law enforcement. And I really apologize for doing this, but I am absolutely exhausted. And, you know, I guess you guys are more used to this than I. I've just been on this Zoom all day long, and I just need to break. But thank you so much. And I know Gina and Kimberly and Precious will let me know if anything came up that I really need to know about. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Trish. I think we're all there, so we will move to wrap up, but you feel free to drop. Yeah, but let's take these last two questions and then move to wrapping up. Go ahead, Devonte.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to say I really appreciate the insight that the COG's providing. It does appear to me like you guys are all speaking more to the information part of the data that Dr. Gita referenced earlier, as opposed to the statistical data. You know, I myself have experienced loss, you know, to gun violence, so I completely understand. I get it. But I guess I'm just very concerned about the internal agency that you guys mentioned that produces the stops data without the input of PPB. Primarily because when you release reports, the public's going to judge they're going to judge the reports for what they are, right? And so obviously there's active investigations that are ongoing, but you know, if we don't have any of that context, then we can't assume something that we aren't being told, right? So it goes back to that transparency part. You know, and just the insight that you all provided, you know, makes the stops data that we just went through a lot easier to swallow, right? It explains some of it, right? To know that, okay, well, they are divulging this information. PPB is divulging this information to you guys during these sessions, but that they aren't, none of that is translating to the information that they're giving to everyone else. And there's a way, just the same way that you guys did, where you didn't really divulge, but you explained, that's completely doable. There is some way to capture that information. And like you said, I mean, that's pretty much the crux of the issue is they're afraid of their feet getting held to the fire, you know, for having to stand behind a statement that they put out. But then their refusal to give the public something is exactly why, you know, the community can't understand and can't really bridge that gap. Right. That's why the community is constantly in a state of outrage, is because there's absolutely nothing given because you're afraid of having to stand behind what you said. Right. But it would be a lot. I mean, I speak for myself. It's much more understandable and respectable and easier to swallow when you're told something and then someone says, you know what, hey, I can take ownership and be accountable. That information was incorrect. That's what we thought we had going on. Right. But this is actually what's really going on, as opposed to being told nothing and then just constantly standing on the other side of the fence as if we're not one community. Right. If this is all about community engaged policing, but you'll never tell the community anything because you're afraid of the community, that's the issue here. So I really just want to say thanks for the insight because it was extremely helpful.
Devonte, everything that you've said, I want you to know I communicated not in as many words, but I literally just communicated that very message to the commander of the FIT at the last meeting. And when he expressed concerns about the community's response to their comments or their thoughts, and I said, but that is the very thing that builds the transparency and the trust that you're seeking. And I understand the concerns, and absolutely there will be people in the community that will twist things and make it hard, but that's true now. Like that's not new. Like, you know, so we have to come someplace to find a solution. And I 100% agree with you. I also want to reiterate that we respect the fact that we as the COG don't want to make recommendations or things that would impede their ability to do their jobs. And it's hard as outsiders, right, as community members, to sort of give PPB feedback about how to do their job when we are not officers and we're learning like the insides and outs to what they're doing. And so we're trying to also be really intentional and respectful of that. And it's a hard balance. I just want to say, like, it's tricky. And I'll just remind everyone too, that we're still very much in the learning phase as much as we are wanting to recommend changes, and we do guide them and we do ask critical questions and we do all of those things, but we're also in the process of just trying to learn about what they do. And that's been that's a whole process unto itself that we can talk about at another time.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're gonna have to wrap up this part here, but we obviously had a lot to talk about, and it was great to have you FitCog folks here for the first time in our space. And I think we'll probably hope to keep the lines of communication open for the future. I think there's obviously our spaces intersected in many ways, and the things you shared were so helpful and insightful. But yeah, just appreciate your time and insight so much. So I do want to honor our public comment period, but I'm just going to speed us straight there. So if you have any public comment that you'd like to share in this meeting, please raise your hand at this time. It can be related to things that we talked about in this meeting or anything else that you would like to share related to stuff that PCCEP works on. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, thanks. Hi, Dan Handelman again, Portland Cop Watch. I really appreciate tonight's discussion, but I still feel like there's one of the appendices in the report you're looking at is 9 pages talking about demographics and benchmarks, which kind of goes back to the same question I kept asking, which is if they're saying a lot of people are coming out from outside of Portland and changing the demographic makeup of our city, why don't they track where the people are from who are being pulled over? Because I don't think that those data will prove that point. I think it will actually disprove that what they're saying. I think they're stopping Portlanders at disproportionate rates. So I'm hoping that one of you groups, FITCOG or PCCEP, will make a recommendation to collect those data. Also, this morning, you may have seen something in the Oregonian or in Oregon Live last night about this. This morning, I testified at City Council because a person's vehicle had a bullet hole that went through their passenger door, through their passenger seat, and landed in their back seat when the Portland police mistakenly pulled over the wrong car and shot and killed Emmanuel Clark Johnson in 2022, a young black man who was unarmed, and he was running away from them. And the bullet went flying through this person's car door. Now, it was 12:30 in the morning, so she wasn't in it, nor was there a passenger in it, but the person could be dead because the Portland police made a mistake and shot at the wrong person and killed him. And we mentioned Keaton Otis before. I heard Pastor Weisner say his name. I put it in the chat before. Keaton Otis was pulled over because the cops thought he looked like a gang member because he was wearing a hoodie in a fancy Toyota, which was his mother's car, on a hot summer's day, which is not the way to do probable cause. That is a way of racially profiling people. And so I think, I've drawn it back to Keaton Otis in 2010 and to Emmanuel Clark Johnson in 2022 because the profiling is still going on. We talk about all this data-driven this and that, but it's all institutionally about racial profiling and where the Black Lives Matter movement was coming from. So I hope that people remember that. And I will post one more time in the chat the link to the table of contents for the newest Cop Watch newsletter, which you can see now online with graphics. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Go ahead, Barbara.
Hi, thank you. This has been extremely informative this evening. I had heard at some point they were trying to take the tactic when there was a murder and then there would be worried about a retaliation. So they were getting, I don't know if it was, I don't remember, it was neighborhood people or some people in to try to talk to the people who might retaliate to talk them out of it. And are they still using that? Because I feel like we want the police to solve a lot of problems that I think are not police problems. The example being most obviously the dangerous streets, and those could be fixed. And it seems to me that the police are a very, very, very powerful element in this city. And I know when they wanted 500 trees cut down, the city did it. So why can't they say, listen, we need to have this corridor that's dangerous fixed, or we need to have the situation that these people are in bettered so they aren't so desperate. And I say that as somebody that works some temp jobs, and I was wondering when I first came to the city in 2012, where all the Black people were. And I have a pension and I was supplementing my income with temp jobs, and there they all were trying to make a living on temp jobs at minimum wage. And there's these larger things that where people are just kept out of the economy, and So that's just what I have to say. And thank you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think this, Barb, your comment relates exactly to what Gina was talking about earlier, that like this is bigger than a policing problem, and we can
Mhm.
recognize the systems that are at play in like protective and risk factors and what sets people up for certain things. And if we think about the other systems besides law enforcement and analyze those, and that's separate work to do, right? Like there's so many parts of that. And so, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that. Anyways.
And or how does PCCEP think about those in tandem with your charge, which is, you know, more narrow, but obviously impacted by those factors. Yeah, it's a really huge and an important question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dr. Allen.
I think what I'm about to say is going to sound absolutely off the wall. So, you know, that's sometimes my job. I think either the legislature or the police department, those are the two places that control of money sits. When everybody decides that they're tired of just running around in circles after information and the complexity of doing the job, doing it constitutionally, doing it with due respect for privacy, doing it well, that they're tired of this rat race, which we're only just starting. I think we'll get better at it year in and year out, that certain jobs in the police department will come with the requirement that there will be a year of paid service to the community after you are no longer a policeman. That service to the community will be a full-time job, and that you will be paid to join one of the advisory groups, mandatory. That certain jobs in the police department will come with that 1 year when they are no longer wearing a uniform, and that there's no way of getting out of it. It comes with the job, and that it will be paid appropriately, like you were when you were in uniform. When we start having that kind of person on our advisory groups, we'll get to know what we're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. And Pastor Weisner with the last comment.
Hi, mine is just an announcement. I just wanted to let everyone know, those who may not have heard, that the NAACP will be having its Freedom Front Gala on this Saturday. And for those that would like to know, here, one of the Tennessee 3 representative, his name is Justin Pearson, who was one that was expelled out of the House of Representatives and reinstated back. But he will be the actual speaker for this event. And it'll be this Saturday at the Oregon Convention. I believe there's still opportunity for those who would like to get tickets, but an outstanding event where that he was, again, part of the 3 of dealing with the gun control out during that, one of his main, excuse me, I'm getting tired like Sister Trish. I've been in meetings too all day, but my main purpose is just to invite people to the NAACP Gala that is going to be this Saturday with State Representative Justin Pearson, who's going to be speaking.
Very good. Thank you, Pastor Reisner. All right. And just quickly, I'll hand it to the co-chairs, Tia and Odelia, to close us out here.
Oops.
Yeah, I can go for it, Tia.
Go for it.
I think this was the start of a lot more conversations, as most PCCEP meetings go. And we have a lot more understanding to do, understanding from the COG about fit in general and all the things and all the knowledge you have. And so I think there's like definitely more conversations we would love to have with you all, and your perspective on lots of things, and then also thinking about kind of the first half of the meeting and the stops data in general. I think this is a place for us to think about things like the veil of darkness that was shared about, and think about racial disparities and how we can kind of move what we see forward and think about what might be missing from the data, or what are the limitations of the data, and how we can propel that to be whatever it may be, if that's asking for transparency or accountability or stopping of certain practices. And kind of this is our launching point of getting there, and hopefully we can continue these conversations. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Tia?
I'll just read the upcoming PCCEP dates and events. Is the next meeting we have is October 7th, the Settlement and Policy Subcommittee meeting, 6 to 8. Come to that. It doesn't show the agenda quite yet, but that'll be up soon, and we hope to see you there. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. I know we're all so tired.
Yes, and shout out to Odelia, who was at a conference all day and then drove 3 hours and immediately got on this meeting.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
thank you to her dedication. Yes, all
Yeah,
right. Thank you
that's
again
it.
to all of our amazing guests. This was a great meeting. It is 8:24 and this meeting is adjourned.
Good
Thank you.
night.
Night.
Good night, everyone.
Recording stopped.